Hello and welcome to Episode 6 of Scottish Tenants News. I'm here with Stephanie. Stephanie, you're a new resident to the Wyndford, so I wonder if you could introduce yourself, tell us a bit about your background.
So I've lived in Wyndford for a year now after the birth of my daughter, who is now 13 months old. I work in a nursery at the moment and I'm a member of Unison. I'm also a member of the Wyndford Residents' Union and a member of the committee on that. Currently campaigning for a few different things, like fight back against the demolition of the high-rise flats without adequate replacement of social housing, and against the plans, the obscure plans for the hub. And also I'm involved in the People's Assembly campaigning against the cost of living crisis. And against some of the Tory policies which are only making that worse.
So, obviously you didn't come from here originally. What kind of differences have you noticed in your 13 months here?
So, I'm originally from Castlemilk. Both Castlemilk and Maryhill are working class communities, long-lasting working class communities. There's generations of families living in both, in the literally opposite ends of the city. But there's a lot of similarities there because there are generational poverty, families with generational poverty existing in both of these areas. The biggest difference for me is the existence of community-based projects in Wyndford in comparison to Castlemilk. Castlemilk, I feel, is a bit further ahead on being run down than what Wyndford and Maryhill is at the moment. I do feel that we're in danger of becoming more austere, just because of the state of the politics right now, and the extraction of our resources constantly from the public sector. I think in Castlemilk we were always trying to fight for a shopping centre, whereas here we've got plenty of amenities. There was nothing in Castlemilk in terms of shopping. It was always kind of getting changed, or like basically the Castlemilk shopping centre has been sitting empty for years, most of my life now. I remember being very young and it was like a booming place to be, whereas now there's really nothing much there, and I've still got a lot of family up there, and when I go and visit I'm always actually surprised at how it's still the same. We've recently received news that there's going to be some sort of like supermarket being built at the main shopping centre in Castlemilk, so hopefully that will make a difference. And there are community groups up there constantly fighting hard to change things. But like I say, I feel like it's just a wee bit further beyond the pale than where we are just now in Maryhill. And we should take it as a foreboding sign of things to come. If we just look at other communities and compare, like Postle and Easterhouse, the different communities that I watched on Scotland Debates last night. They were in Easterhouse, and the sort of things that were being shared there by members of the working class can be understood across the board over Glasgow, over Scotland, over the UK, I would say. So yeah.
What do you think those differences, you could describe them to? I mean, what was it, policy levers, or did something happen? I mean, obviously, right-wing governments in the UK, but was something in particular happened to Castlemilk to deprive it of a thriving shopping centre?
As far as I'm aware, the only reason is because of who owns the shopping centre. It is obviously privately owned, and there are high rents for shop owners that operate in the area, so they were being priced out of their space a bit. And I think the less shops that are there, the more the people who own the shopping centre are wanting to put the price up to cover the shortfall there. I think part of the problem in Castlemilk is a wee bit that can be shared, I think, with us here, is that there's been a bit of gentrification in terms of there's a lot of houses that are to sell, like privately built houses for sale rather than socially owned houses. Mm-hmm. And it's changed the demographics of the area quite a bit. There's a lot of people who can drive, and they can drive to the Asda down at Tory Glen, or they can drive up to East Kilbride. Whereas for the people who have been there, and for working class families, and there's a lot of new refugee and immigrant families in the area who this will apply to as well, the public transport services are shocking. in Castlemilk. It's supposed to be the simplicity service where you get a bus every 10 minutes, but anybody can testify that that's not the case. You wait for half an hour for a bus and 3 turn up at once. It's one of these scenarios. So that's alienating the people who can't afford to drive from accessing shops. It costs probably about as much as it would cost you to get your family onto a bus to go down to Asda as it would cost to just take a taxi. So it's a mixture of things, but I think the main thing has been the change in demographics in the area, and there's no need for amenities there because people aren't going local for use of them anymore.
Well, I mean, that strikes me as quite interesting because you have had demolition in Castlemilk. So obviously, a lot of the houses that were built around about the same time have been demolished, and presumably that's where they built the new bought houses. Is that right? Yeah.
There was also in Homebuyer they've pulled down a lot of schools, and then in those sorts of sites they're building privately owned houses as well. There was a school, Netherley Primary School was in Homebuyer when I was very young. That got pulled down, and the houses that were built there, a bit of a mix, but most of them were bought houses or buy-to-let houses. And it had a big impact on just that small scheme of Homebuyer in Castlemilk. It had a big impact in my memory on the area. And then there's also the Mitchell Hill flats got pulled down, and it's that site lay derelict for a long time, which, as you know, like the same sort of things happened with the Valley here, where it's just been left. And I think that's why we need change in policy in terms of how long this land is allowed to be left derelict without the people who own it from using it for whatever purposes. This is a problem across the board, I think, with all communities. Where sites are just sitting there not being used.
I mean, not even just urban. I mean, there's been various investigations that there's over 2,000 vacant land sites across the country. But one of the things that strikes me about what you're saying in terms of the impact that these people have perhaps got a bit more wealth have had on the community is it's been more focused on car development, and policymakers, for the past 20 years, 30 years maybe, have been talking about mixed communities as the answer to poverty. And what you're describing is something quite different, I think.
Yeah, I think as well, sometimes there's too much of a tendency to focus on antisocial behaviour, and I think if you've got a mixed community, sometimes you're not getting the real analysis that we need for the causes of antisocial behaviour. People coming from outside would look at antisocial behaviour and say that's individuals acting out and it's bad people. Whereas if you're from a community that sees the development and the growth of antisocial behaviour, you can point exactly to the starvation of public resources. Mm-hmm. That's the reason for antisocial behaviour. There's nothing for people to do. People are angsty. Nothing for us to access, and it breeds drinking culture, drug culture. And so on and so forth. Young people don't have anything to do, and I know that sounds like an excuse, but it's the truth. That there's no public service.
Because going back to that question of mixed communities, when public housing was first envisaged, the idea was that it was for everyone. It wasn't a type of housing of last resort, or something that you needed points to get into.
Yeah.
And obviously that's not to say that someone in dire housing needs should be deprived of a house, but at the same time, this idea that the only way you're going to have a varied demographic is by knocking public housing down and replacing it with owner-occupied housing. It sort of changes the ideological landscape of a neighbourhood.
Yeah, absolutely agree. That I believe that social housing should be something that people can choose to live in, not something that's only based on need. And I think because it's only based on need, they're constantly trying to narrow the amount of space that there is there for people and redefine who it is specifically that you categorise as needing. And yeah, I totally agree with that. And then it does come down to ideology. It comes from the belief that we should all own our own homes, which how lovely it would be if we could all afford to do that, but it's not the reality. And the only way of keeping it fair is, I think the way I see it is that we all, if it's publicly owned, then it's all our homes. And you do own your home if we all own them. So yeah.
Yeah, of course. And I mean, in tandem with that expansion of home ownership, you know, there have been other effects. I mean, what would you, how would you analyse what's going on across Scotland? I mean, one of the things that strikes me is you have this definition of affordable, which is 80% of the market rents in an area.
Yeah.
And that means that as long as so-called social housing is less than 20% less than the market rate, no matter what the market rate is, that social housing is affordable. And you can end up in a situation where the rents in public housing are so high they're a barrier to employment.
Yeah. I think rather than everything's constantly driven by the market, isn't it? Like, it's as if it's almost religious how much the market drives things. We'll let the market fix it. And it's the same with the response to the cost of living crisis right now, with the sort of things that Rishi Sunak is saying. It's very hands-off. There's only so much I can do. I can only mitigate the effects of this. Whereas, like, again, last night when I was watching Scotland debates, there was a guy who asked the panellists, where do you get the money from? And someone said, well, we need to tax the rich. And he was like, well, you know where the money is, go and get it. And it's just that simple for people like us. We all know, we can see the billionaires getting richer, and we can see the how much that's starving our communities in order to furnish them constantly. And it does always come down to ideology, and I think we should be assessing what is affordable based on the circumstances that normal people are living in, rather than constantly looking at the market for our answers. And I'm aware always as well that decisions are made at government level without speaking to the trade unions, and without speaking to tenants unions, and without speaking to working communities. Therefore, how can they ever make decisions for our benefit if they're not even listening to us?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting because that definition of affordable effectively means that you're going to see above inflation rent rises in public housing almost indefinitely. As long as the market continues to rise, then public housing rents continue to rise. And that's a very ideological difference from the idea that public housing would be a lever to control rents and to make rents more affordable. Yeah,
I would say so. And it's the same as how there's an argument that we can't put wages up because it will make inflation worse. But at the same time, how are we supposed to afford the cost of living rising, and how are we supposed to afford the rents going up? It's going to force people into homelessness. It's getting to that desperate state, and it's all for ideological reasons. And we need, our duty, I think, as grassroots campaigners, is to try and lift the veil from people, because all the media is constantly bombarding you with the same level of ideology. Of there's no answer, we have to pull together and suffer together, rather than, well, we know where the money is, let's go and get it, like I say.
And obviously there's other aspects to this, you know, how do we fund the innovations we need to tackle the climate crisis? I mean,
tax the oil companies.
Well, yeah, but also, you know, the government is envisaging that owner-occupiers and private individuals will fund this big capital-intensive project to ensure that every home by, I think, 2045 meets a passive house energy standard. And, you know, they've got £1.7 billion they've got over this Parliament to do that. But the estimate is that the cost to meet that, just in terms of the outlay, would be more than 50 billion. So, you know, we've got 25 years. Yeah.
I think there's often a misconception as well that people who own their homes can afford this, but actually it is a lot of people that own their homes are working class, and they've got a limited income. A lot of people have retired and they've got a fixed income who own their own homes, and then Even like I'm not the biggest fan of landlords, but even some landlords can't afford to do it either. The insulation and the different requirements that are coming into place to respond to the climate crisis. Even like sorry, I don't remember what I was going to say there.
Well, I mean, it's interesting that the cost of government borrowing right now is at a historic low. At this point, if the UK government was to issue loads of treasury bonds, in effect, it'd be printing money.
Yeah.
And it comes back to that question of ideology. You know, how do we make this capital investment? Well, we don't.
Yeah. Yeah.
In Wyndford, there is a district heating scheme which kind of ties into that question, and it is owned by the landlord and was funded by the government for the most part, and yet it's operated by Scottish and Southern Energy.
Yeah. I was told when I first moved into Wyndford that programme was going to save me money on my energy bills, but as the reality's shown that it hasn't. My bills are more expensive than they were when I lived in Castlemilk, and it's going to go up. I told yesterday that my bill's expected to double next month. So
And that's the heating.
Yeah. So I don't know how they get away with the level of lying. That's what it is. It's straight up lying. I was told, actually, someone at GHA told me it was going to cost me £8 a week to heat my house, and that is never how little it's been costing me. And like I say, I've got a baby, and through the winter months there, a very cold winter there was no way I was going to suffer not putting the heating on when I needed to warm my house for her. Yeah. But at the same time, I can't afford it.
And I gather from obviously the Wyndford Residents' Union has had previous negotiations with SSE around trying to change the tariff structures, and from some of those dialogues we found that power station, that gas-fired power station, which is the basis of the heating system that we have communally, the gas for it is bought on the spot market. So this idea that you could buy the cheapest gas anywhere in Europe at a moment's notice, which that's the market that was subject to a 3,000% rise. Yeah. Just basically a lack of long-term planning and very short-termist approach, and obviously the direct impact is, as you say, how do you heat your home? Yeah,
and I've heard for about 10 years now that we're going to be investing in renewable energy sources. And where are the windmills? Like, where is this renewable energy? It's the scale that we need to be working towards isn't happening yet, and it's the letdown from that COP26. I didn't have high hopes in the first place, but the public meetings and the people's meetings that I attended came away with that with so many aspirations, so many ideas, and the innovation among normal working people, and the desire to get out there and fight for a better climate and a future for young people it's there, but there isn't an aspiration to do that from the top. We're not being met there.
And I mean, it's interesting, Maryhill, because we are surrounded in our own way by water.
Yeah.
It used to be called Little Venice because of the canal and the Kelvin. There was a study done by an engineering company commissioned by Glasgow University, which found that the Glasgow University's campus could be heated entirely from a heat pump from the River Kelvin. The same heat pump that was installed in Maryhill could heat half of Maryhill.
Wow, that just shows you how the ideas are there. They just need to be taken up and funded properly. And like I say, we could be. I know the Scottish Government don't have the kind of tax raising powers that I'm talking about here. I'm talking about the UK government. We need to be taxing the highest earners and those with wealth sitting there, like asset wealth, and that, like I say, the oil companies, that there's money there that we could be taxing. That option isn't being explored at all for ideological reasons, but it's necessary in order to furnish the green industrial revolution that we speak about, and that has to come hand in hand with social housing, 100%, and better sustainable public transport that's publicly owned.
I maybe want to talk a wee bit about that in terms of community unions, because it's a really tough gig to force the UK government to do something.
Yeah.
I remember at the start of the pandemic, there was a coming together of different organisations, community-based unions, Living Rent, Acorn, the London Renters Union, I think CATU as well. They were trying to force the UK government to bring in basically a rent rebate for renters. And even supposing it just seemed like, sorry, but use the phrase pissing in the wind. What do you think about the kind of organisation that would be necessary to change UK government policy?
It has to be across the board. It has to come from the trade unions as well as community-based organising and tenants unions. It's going to have to involve sacrifice from us in terms of people are going to have to strike and people are going to have to disobey in order to make them listen.
Mm-hmm.
We don't even have at the moment proper media outlets, so it's very hard to get the message out there, especially even just to the masses, to the public. When you're trying to organise in the community, sometimes it's like you're speaking an alien language to people because they've got this ideological hat on, forced on them by the media that's constantly surrounding us. And we can't, the media is all in the hands of like a handful of different groups, right? So how are you supposed to break into that? It's very difficult, and people think social media is the answer, and how far has it got us now?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I appreciate it's a bit of a stab in the dark, but what do you think we should be doing on the ground in communities like Wyndford?
It's building class consciousness, I think.
How do we go about that?
Speaking to people as much as we can, face-to-face or over the phone. Organising events for people to attend and ask the questions that they want to ask. And then organising events where we get to hold politicians and decision makers to account on these things as well as the public. And a bit of propaganda as well, some simple messaging out there through leaflets, flyers. There's great sticker campaigns going on in Glasgow right now as well that are promoting climate consciousness that I think would be great. I've got a flat, there's a few different campaigns going on with the STUC and like the Get Glasgow Moving campaign for public transport. All these sorts of things should be more embedded in community organised groups. And even if we had some sort of regular meeting with the different community groups, even just in Glasgow, so we can get some synchronised messaging, really basic, simplistic messaging that is consistent across the board.
So, I mean, you mentioned the election there. Obviously, in Maryhill, there's a lot of things happening. You know,
yeah.
You've got the demolitions proposed for the high flats in the Wyndford, the hub, the threat of that being demolished and sold for private housing, the Kleiner Street campaign, still game for the Valley, and then all the battles over what happens to Clamant Street and the surrounding vacant land there.
Yeah.
What do you think, if you had a message for politicians?
It would be either listen to what our demands are, and that includes we demand more socially owned housing that is furnished to meet the needs of the climate crisis that we're in, so that we can cheaply heat our homes, and that they're not too hot in the summer and they're not too cold in the winter, sort of thing. Properly insulated, socially owned housing. Publicly owned transport systems that are climate efficient. There's a list of demands there that I think that we as community groups have. We share them in common, and there are variants across the board, but if they're not prepared to meet our demands, then they need to step out of the way. That's how I see it, and I think if we can get some working class candidates out there actually saying the message themselves, or the ones who are already there, we can pressure them to say it for us. That would be ideal as well, because you know yourself that most of the politicians aren't from the working class. They come from a tiny minority of schools. Even they're friends with each other. So it's there isn't a good spread of demographic in the political class, and that's why they're not making decisions to suit a wide spread of demographics.
I'm mindful of the fact that a few weeks ago we went to deliver a letter to Councillor Kenny McLean, who's basically head of housing. I think what they call it, communities, and I forget the exact title, but he's head of housing at the council, and obviously they don't have public housing anymore. They've sold it off to the GHA, but he hasn't met with us.
Well, he's a wuss.
He's on the board of the GHA to represent the people. Yeah.
The hypocrisy there needs to be pointed out to the public. He needs to get a showing up in the lead up to this election campaign, held to account in public. I think if we could get some sort of, I know that you did have at that day there were posters being used, to hold him to account and ask the question, why are you not representing us when that's what your job is? You're paid to do that. That it is about giving him a showing up.
And of course, he's the councillor for the neighbouring ward, Partick East and Kelvindale.
Yeah.
So, in theory, people in Maryhill could go and door chat his constituents.
Yeah. That would be a good idea to make sure that they know that he doesn't have the community's interests at heart. Why is he on the board of GHA? What benefits is he getting out of that? Because it must be personal if he's not interested in listening to the tenants of GHA or the residents of GHA communities.
Well, it seems that the council is keen on building houses, just private houses.
Yeah.
And he's been very keen to say that Kalina Street should be 400 mostly luxury apartments.
Well, it's no use to people who live here already, is it, and whose homes are at threat of being demolished as it is. They're going to be left with nowhere to stay that's local.
And the council's been talking about building between 1,500 and 2,000 houses along the canal.
Prime real estate. Great location. It would be fantastic to live there. It's the canal's a good connector to different parts of the city. And it would be a shame if the only people that ever got to experience that were all coming from the same social class, because it would suit the ones that aren't driving to have access to that link.
Yeah, and of course there's a question of green space as well.
Yeah, absolutely. The people from the high rises, and I stay in one of the multi-storey buildings, but not one of the buildings that are in threat of being demolished. And I used to have a garden, and I miss having a garden. And I feel that I don't have a lot. There is a lot of greenery in the area, don't get me wrong, but it's not well kept. It's full of litter, full of dog dirt. It's just not kept well at all. And I think it's on purpose. It's to force us out, essentially. If you can private rent and get your own garden, then a lot of people would see that as a better option.
But this weekend, the Still Game for the Valley campaign is having a public meeting to discuss an alternative vision for Maryhill. As you know, a mother to a young child recently moved to this community for its resources. What would you have as your alternative vision for the redevelopment of Maryhill?
One of the biggest crises that I faced when I first moved here was the lack of freely or cheaply accessible activities for me as a young mum with my baby to go and do. Because of the pandemic, they used it as an excuse to shut down as much as they could. So one of the things at top of my agenda would be some more easily accessible creche and childcare options, as well as activities to keep young people engaged in the area. I think decent transport system is one of the things that are definitely at the top of my list. And like I say, socially owned homes that are sustainably built for the future. We want to build houses that we don't need to, in 40 years' time, pull them down because they're not sustainable, because that's what the excuse is. We want to build homes that will last and leave a legacy for children and young people. And I think also Maryhill Road used to be thriving, lots of different small businesses. We need to try and draw that back again, because so much of it's closed now. There's not if you're going along Maryhill Road, you need to kind of have a reason. You need to know where you're going. You couldn't just go have a wee ponder along there and have a look about. There's hardly anything open. So that's another thing that I would have in the area, and access to green spaces. I like the idea of allotments and things, which I know up at Colina Street and different places in Maryhill do that. I think it could be scaled up a bit more though, especially for people that are living in multi-storey apartments. And I'd maybe have a vision along the line, maybe it wouldn't suit everybody, but I think we should all have our own access to the open fresh air as well, because I don't have a balcony or a veranda or anything like that. And I have to say, in periods of lockdown, if I was to be stuck in that space and not have access to the fresh air, it would have a detrimental effect on my mental health, and I'm sure a lot of people would share that.
Yeah. I mean, I know that if you're a commuter from Bearstane or Mulgai, you tend to refer to our neighbourhood as the Maryhill Corridor.
Yeah.
Which sits next to the Porcelain Corridor.
Yeah.
And obviously, we're not corridor.
Yeah.
A worse term I've heard is Scary Hill.
Oh.
And it's true, we are used as a means of going to somewhere else from people who don't live here.
Yeah, that was actually a similar thing for Castlemilk, because people would be coming from like the sort of East Kilbride, Newton Mearns, sort of areas, Clarkston, passing through Castlemilk, so to get into the city centre or so on. I've had an experience of that my whole life. And it makes us, it belittles us and dehumanises us to speak like that, because people live and work here and we want to thrive here as well.
But it really ties in with what you're talking about, an integrated public transport system.
Absolutely, yeah.
You know, if those people lived in London, for example, the chances are they'd be getting a commuter train. Yeah,
and think about how limited the subway system is in Glasgow. It's a circle. People actually, when they come from elsewhere and they've experienced other subway systems like London's, they laugh at how simple our wee subway system is with the inner and the outer circle. But having lived in Castlemilk, there's no trains that go. The closest you can get to in Castlemilk by train is Kings Park, and here, even the train station, Maryhill train station, it's quite a bit of a walk away from here for me anyway, with a baby. So, and to be relying on one bus all the time when you've got a pram, and sometimes you go to get on the bus and there's already two prams on the bus, so you can't get on. You need to wait on the next one. God forbid you've got an appointment to get to. And I'm sure everybody that's had to wait at a bus stop in Maryhill Road would agree that the service is appalling. And if we had other options, if we had better service trains, for example, we wouldn't all have to be going along the same route all the time. And just another point, the policy on free public transport for under 22-year-olds, I don't have an issue with that at all. I think it's a good initiative. But at the same time, how many under 22-year-olds weren't already using the buses? How many of them were drivers? How much is this going to help household incomes? Because I could be doing with free public transport as being in receipt of universal credit on being on a low income, and I don't qualify because I'm over 22. And there's loads of people like that who could economically benefit from free bus travel. And I think if we had some sort of system where a pass would get you on a bus, a train, trams even, imagine it. And it's funny that they were able to cater to the visitors for COP26, an Oyster card sort of thing, but it's too good for the actual residents of Glasgow.
Yeah. What do you think about the council's active travel policy? Because they have been extending cycle lanes and some of these sort of ad hoc cycle lanes. Yeah.
I do cycle as well sometimes, and I used to cycle a lot more, but the cycle lanes are a welcome addition to some parts of the city. When I used to work in Partick, I could cycle all the way there and back without issue. Very easy to do, and it's because it's in a more affluent area. If I was to cycle from Castlemilk into the town, I would come across all sorts of hazards. It's not accessible whatsoever. It's not safe. My sisters live there, and I actually don't encourage them to cycle because it's actually dangerous. So I welcome it, but I think it needs to be more. Like I say, it's always, they do things in smalls all the time rather than scaling things right out there and creating jobs while doing it.
Well, this comes back to this ideology question, because there you are, you're talking about Castlemilk, and presumably you've got an area of low income, so what you want to do is you raise the people up. You want everyone to have good, high-paying jobs. So presumably, I mean, okay, Zoom and so on, all these technologies have enabled that. You can work from home, but there will be people who need to commute to work.
Yeah.
But it strikes me, when they look at the commuter aspect of things, they don't see it in terms of this could encourage development.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, it's like I was listening to a politician yesterday talking about how many jobs have been saved by the Scottish Government in shipbuilding, for example. Rather than talking about creating jobs, it's about saving jobs all the time. Well, there isn't enough to go round. We're not creating anything here anymore. We've got a service-based economy. People don't have a lot of skills anymore. And that level of de-skilling the working class has also disempowered it, I would say.
Sure.
It feels very deliberate. You could raise up the workers, but why would we bother? Because they'll just get too big heads and they'll want more. Mm-hmm. That's how it feels.
But if your agenda was different, if your agenda was to genuinely raise up communities,
mm-hmm.
it would start with that infrastructure question.
Absolutely. I remember the 2017 Labour manifesto and the level of expenditure that was going to be involved in that in terms of building up British infrastructure and creating green jobs. Mm-hmm. That there isn't aspiration like that at the moment as far as mainstream politics goes, and that's why it is important for us at the community level to keep those aspirations high and keep these sorts of ideas on the agenda. I think we do need to invest in green jobs. I think we could invest in shipbuilding again because and we could do it in a green way. We're an island nation. We've got plenty of access to water, and seafaring is almost extinct here. Mm-hmm. So there's plenty of opportunity there.
Well, we're kind of coming towards the sort of end of the interview. I just wonder if you had any kind of further reflections on what should communities like ours be doing to get themselves organised, to have those aspirations, to change the policy dialogue, to flip the ideology, if you like.
Yeah. I think sometimes community-based organisations have a tendency to, it's only a handful of people who do all the work. And I think if we delegate the work across the membership a bit more, those who are willing in the membership a bit more, it would create a greater investment in community-based organising. And also, that's what we want. We want to be owned by our members and we want to be for our members. And the best way of doing that is to have as much membership involvement as possible. And at the same time, that has to go with a massive membership drive. And as we recruit new members, discussing with them what their skills are, what their interests are, and trying to help them to utilise their skills and interests for the cause, basically, to try and get them to become drivers of the thing rather than passerby or what does it have to do. So I think, no, you tell us what we can do to empower people at the grassroots level. And like I said before, I think some across the board simplistic messaging that is consistent across grassroots campaigners. I think the cost of living crisis gives us a good opportunity to do that as well, despite it being horrific and the situation that a lot of people are going to be forced into. Heating or eating is going to be horrific and it's going to go on for a long time. That crisis does give us an opportunity to act, and it gives us motivation. It gives us a bit of a catalyst to get going with it, and it's a good talking point that everybody can share in. Everybody's going to be affected by the cost of living crisis, no matter where you come from.
Yeah, because communities have, particularly working class communities, really have lost that civil society in a lot of places. And I mean, what you're discussing used to, in a trade union context, used to be called the organising model.
Yeah.
But it strikes me, if you interview people from who moved into estates like this when they began, they had tenant management cooperatives, they had they had letting agreements, they had real strength and depth in membership.
Yeah.
And many of the members of those tenants committees and tenants associations would also have been members of their trade union in their workplace.
Yeah. Yeah, which would help a consistent message to spread across all these different organisations. And I do feel that modern life is squeezing us a bit in terms of the time that you've got to spread across all this different type of organising.
Mm-hmm.
Even like, again, coming back to public transport, you're waiting that long to get from A to B that you don't have a lot of time to do anything when you get there.
Yeah.
So there's time being taken out of your life as well as money being taken out of your life. Constantly from all angles, the squeeze is coming in, and and then not to mention anti-trade union law that's come into place. I think 2011 or something like that was David Cameron crunched down on trade unions again. So all these things we need to try and we're fighting to create class consciousness and to move back the way in a sense, to build up the strength that we once had. And there's nothing greater than a crisis to do that. It's trying to put a positive spin on things.
Well, that's one way of looking at it. In the meantime, how do we fund our existence?
People are able to think collectively when it counts. We showed how we were able to think collectively during the COVID-19 pandemic. People were thinking of others, and we've all en masse started wearing masks, sanitising, following the correct procedures. If people are able to do that, what else can we ask them to do?
And the so-called magic money tree appeared.
Yeah, absolutely.
By magic.
Absolutely. That was 2008 all over again.
Yeah.
Bail them out.
Yeah. So, thanks for that, Stephanie. Any last thoughts?
Just if I can encourage people, there's equal pay strikes on next week. There's going to be a march for equal pay, for gender equal pay for education and care workers on Tuesday, starting from Glasgow Green. So I just want to encourage everybody to get involved in that fight as well, because it's all one. Yeah, and it's fair to say that women make communities. Absolutely. It sounds like a sexist thing to say, but on the one hand, it's also true. Yeah. Okay, thanks. Thank you.